and parody songs as Terry Fader, the world's top ventriloquist, takes center stage at the Strat Hotel Casino and Tower. Be prepared to be mesmerized by Fader's incredible talent as he brings to life a cast of characters who showcase the iconic songs that define the soundtrack of our lives. Terry Fader, one man, 100 voices, 1,000 laughs.
Welcome to Hash House A Go-Go, where we've been serving farm.
The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the program's participants and do not necessarily reflect those of station staff, management, and advertisers.
Liberalism is back in style. Welcome to the evolution.
What if you knew Fox News was just lying to you? How could you watch when you know?
He was voted Variety Entertainer of the Year in the Excellence in the Arts Award. And is one of the highest Arbitron, now Nielsen-rated talk radio hosts in Las Vegas. He is also a refreshing voice of logic and reason. Live from the entertainment capital of the world, Doug Basham.
And good morning, my fellow wokes and Republican jokes. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Doug Basham, and welcome to the Doug Basham Show right here on KSHP in Las Vegas and on social media, and to a genuine demonstration of excellence in broadcasting. Hey everybody, it's wonderful to see you all again. I am Doug Basham. My website is dougbasham.com. Last name is spelled B as in Bob, A-S-H-A-M as in Mary, dougbasham.com. My email, doug@dougbasham.com. And a sincere welcome to those of you listening on KSHP, AM 1400 and 107.1 FM on your radio dial here in Las Vegas. We are also broadcasting on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, TikTok, and of course, Twitter/X. But back to my website. Again, dougbasham.com. You'll find it's all of one page. At the top, you'll find the show's logo. Underneath, 11 links, most to my social media sites. Also one to contact me via email. The two links I'd like to call your attention to the most are, 1, my YouTube page, and 2, my TikTok page. On my YouTube page, I would respectfully ask you hit the subscribe button. On my TikTok page, please hit the red follow button. And normally at this point, I would ask that if you can, catch the show on my YouTube page. Reason being, when I play clips, I don't play audio clips, I play video clips. I'd like to amend that. From my website, dougbasham.com, by all means, go to my YouTube page and click on the subscribe link. That helps the show. Then go back to my website, then go to either my Twitter or Facebook page to watch the show. Reason being, YouTube of late has been suspending my show midstream, and all you see for 5-7 minutes at a time is a black screen that says stream suspended for policy violations. Apparently, I'm almost as lawless as former President Treason Weasel. And then once the show's over, they delete it from my YouTube page. 221-7283 is our call-in number here at the station, folks. If you would like to talk on the radio somewhere in our second half hour, that's 702-221-SAVE, as in save our democracy, which is our ultimate and only goal in each and every show we do. And as the estimable Joy Behar said recently on The View,
I mean, he's cost a lot. I think we should lock him up now.
Well, some of
20 days to go, folks. Just 20 short days. As always, I will ask you, how in the fresh hell is this election close, or is it? Number 2, when Trump loses in November, will Trumpism die? Quick programming note, folks, at approximately 1/4 the hour, we expect to be joined by Glenn Kirschner. Glenn is a former U.S. Army prosecutor. He served in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. for 24 years, and he is an NBC legal analyst. In the interim, let's get to our breaking news of the day. Well, Kamala Harris and her campaign made the decision to venture into the belly of the beast, foray into the lion's den, infiltrate enemy hostile territory. Choose your favorite metaphor. As for how I feel about this decision, firstly, I'm on record, on the air, as having criticized Joe Biden for even allowing Fox into the White House press briefing room. I have also asked, and I've held this position for years, if not decades, why is Fox even allowed to be on the air? Seriously, Fox is not by any stretch of the imagination a news organization, and they were never meant to be. That's not what they were created to be. Fox Noise was the right's revenge for a legitimate media taking down a corrupt Republican president in Richard Nixon. Roger Ailes, one of the founding forces behind Fox, was a media consultant for Richard Nixon. Fox's business model has never been news. Rather, from their very inception, their MO has been to twist and distort the news in favor of the right. In short, it's a propaganda network, plain and simple, period. The only nations in which networks like Fox Noise are allowed to exist are dictatorships that are ruled by authoritarian dictators / strongmen. And yet, here in America, we have one right here. And in the era and error of Trump, we have a shameless network designed to parrot the lies and propaganda their right-wing cult leader and master vomits in order to brainwash their audience into first normalizing him and his lies, and then believing those lies and throwing their unconditional support behind someone who is in reality a pathological liar, a lawless dictator wannabe, a convicted felon, an adjudicated rapist, and someone who's facing both espionage and RICO charges, along with conspiracy to defraud the American people by trying to steal an election he lost charges. All that has been normalized by Fox and the entirety of right-wing propaganda hate media. And thanks to Fox Noise and myriad right-wing networks, a sizable contingent of the American populace has been brainwashed into believing dear leader has been the victim of countless witch hunts and hoaxes. And as a result, they don't see him as a dictator wannabe, but rather a poor, innocent victim who has every right to seek retribution and revenge and even imprisonment for those who wronged him and even those who just disagree with him. And as Trump and his media, their brainwashing dives even deeper into whatever's left of their audience's brains, more and more Trump's base identifies with their dear leader, and they consider themselves to be victims along with him. They sink so far that they start believing the ridiculous lie that they are really after them. It's only Donald Trump who's bravely standing in their way. I have a whole lengthy anti-Fox Noise rant festering inside me. I'll blurt that out someday when we don't have a guest. And before we get to the interview, Bear began with the day's headlines, a couple of which I'm sure he hated to have to report. And listen to what he saved for last.
First, a look at today's other headlines. North Carolina's governor says nearly $100 million in relief aid has already been dispersed to people affected by Hurricane Helene. Nearly 200,000 in the state have applied for federal assistance. The Dow climbed 337 points today to another record close. The S&P 500 finished ahead 27. The Nasdaq was up 51. The latest Fox News poll out tonight has former President Donald Trump with a 2-point advantage nationally. Harris among likely voters. That flips the Democrats' 2-point edge in September. Now, my exclusive interview with Vice President Harris.
And I have a lot more on that interview, which I thought was more of an interrogation. But right now, our special guest is making his second appearance here on the show. He is no stranger to this show's audience, as we have featured countless clips from him in past shows. His name is Glenn Kirschner. He served in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. for 24 years, rising to the position of Chief of Homicide Section. In that capacity, Glenn supervised 30 homicide prosecutors and oversaw all homicide grand jury investigations and prosecutions in Washington, D.C. One of his cases became the subject of an Emmy Award-winning HBO documentary, Thug Life in D.C. Yet another was the subject of a major motion picture directed by and starring Christoph Waltz, titled Georgetown. He's also a former wrestler and all-conference football player and is now the host of his own seminal and important podcast, Justice Matters. I suspect the only two areas in which he is not proficient are brain surgery and motorcycle repair, and I'm not too sure about that second one. Regular listeners to my show know he was my first choice to be Joe Biden's Attorney General. He will be my first choice to be Kamala Harris's Attorney General. Glenn, it is an honor and a pleasure to have you here again. Thanks for joining us, and welcome back to the show, sir.
Hey, Doug, it's great to be back with you.
Glenn, it has been a minute, a long minute, since Trump's legal woes dominated the headlines. Partially understandable because we're now only 3 weeks away from the most critical election in our nation's history. But so much time has passed without any major news. Many of us are wondering where they are now, and we're thinking of the old axiom, out of sight, out of mind. And the first issue I'd like to discuss, what most people call Trump's hush money trial, I call it Trump's falsifying business records in order to rig an election trial. And please forgive me for setting this up in detail. But Judge Juan Merchan postponed Trump's sentencing date from September 18th until after the election, November 26th. And September 18th was already a postponed date from July 11th. And this reminds me of one of the talking points / lies we've been hearing from Orange Caligula concerning his trials and tribulations. Let the people decide. You know, like the average citizen could walk into a courtroom and decry and attack a jury verdict by suggesting their fate be left up to the will and votes of the American people. Now, Glenn, I'm no legal scholar, but with this decision, it appears to me anyway that Judge Merchan is essentially declaring that some voters, and a minority at that, which would be the case if Trump won, it appears Merchan is saying that a minority of voters should have the power to erase criminal behavior. As I understand it, that's not how our justice system is supposed to work. And I believe Merchan knows that. Am I wrong? And how do you feel about this sentencing postponement until after the election?
I don't feel good about it, Doug, but I'm not going to suggest that Judge Merchan is up to no good, that he did something that was either nefarious or that was based on improper considerations. Here's the way I see it. First of all, Judge Merchan did a wonderful job, in my opinion, presiding over a really challenging case, challenging for a number of reasons. And the jury, of course, once they got the evidence, they convicted Donald Trump in a New York minute of 34 felony crimes. I'm glad you don't call it the hush money case. I don't either. I call it the election interference case, because that was the goal of Donald Trump's criminal falsification of business records. It was to cover up, to disguise hush money payments that were made. Why? To gain unfair advantage in a presidential election. It's an election interference case. Donald Trump is a one-trick pony. He is forever interfering in American elections. But here is where Justice Merchan in New York, they call their trial court judges Justice. I'll call him Judge Merchan. Here is where things are at the moment. He set the case for sentencing. And in the interim, you have those six corrupt Supreme Court justices, the radical right-wing ideologue bloc of the Supreme Court, who conjured up out of whole cloth presidential immunity. Not one word of it exists in our Constitution. They made it up, and they tried to do an enormous favor for Donald Trump. And so the reality is, once the Supreme Court announced that presidents can commit many crimes against the American people and not be prosecuted, not be held accountable for it, Judge Merchan was in a position where he was going to have to litigate whether any of the evidence that the Supreme Court has for the first time said is improper, can't be introduced against the president when he's being tried for crimes, whether any of it impacted the jury's guilty verdicts. That is not only challenging litigation for Judge Merchan, it's unprecedented because it's never been done before, because presidents in our nation's history have never had, nor have they needed, presidential immunity. So here is where he found himself. He had to litigate that issue. Now, mind you, he's a state court judge. These are largely federal issues under federal law. So I think there were a couple of things at play that prompted him to continue the sentencing until after the election. One, I actually think he wanted to await some litigation by federal courts, like Judge Chutkan, who was about to undertake this identical litigation, whether the crimes Donald Trump committed against the American people on and around January 6th should enjoy presidential immunity or not. And I think he will ultimately perhaps use that as a guide when he has to take up the same litigation. So that's one reason. But here's the more important reason I think Judge Merchan decided to continue the sentencing until significantly down the road. Because litigating an issue that involves immunity is one of the very few issues that is instantly appealable once a judge makes an immunity ruling, Donald Trump wouldn't have been sentenced anyway. Here's why. Judge Merchan first would have to resolve the presidential immunity issue, and then he would say, now we're going to proceed to sentencing. But the law wouldn't permit it, Doug. The law says no. An immunity ruling is immediately appealable, so everything would have come to a screeching halt anyway. So I actually think there are both legal and practical reasons why Judge Merchan made the decision he made, even though, believe me, I wanted to see Donald Trump sentenced for those crimes at the earliest opportunity.
Yeah. And you know, Glenn, I don't want to be too hard on Justice Merchan, but the way I was looking at it is like any informed, intelligent American. He knows the only reason Trump is running is to avoid going to prison and to imprison everyone who had a hand in exposing him for the lifelong criminal he's always been. Merchan, his staff, his family, they've all been subjected to threats from Trump's brain-dead MAGA cult base. Merchan knows full well what a danger Trump is to this country and our democracy, but it seems like, and I guess I'm wrong, but it seemed to me like he was worried more about being fair to Trump in his defense. And my thought was, what about showing fairness to our system of justice, the public's right to a speedy trial? What about showing fairness to our nation? I guess I'm off base.
Yeah, I think it really was that his legal hands were tied because he knew that issue would be immediately appealable. So there's no way he could proceed the sentencing anyway. So against that backdrop, I think his decision made some sense. But I'm with you in the way that, you know, Donald Trump and his lapdogs, his flunkies, his lackeys, and his sycophants, including the ones in Congress like Jim Jordan, have been going after Judge Merchan and his family members. I mean, Jim Jordan, for gosh sake, who wouldn't comply with a congressional subpoena when he was being asked to provide incriminating evidence against Donald Trump. He criminally defied that subpoena, and yet now he has weaponized government to subpoena Judge Merchan's daughter and people down in Georgia. Why? To try to obstruct those state court prosecutions. I had the opportunity a few weeks ago to testify to Congress to Jim Jordan's weaponization of government committee. And I sure laid out my position about how it was really Jim Jordan and company who were weaponizing government to try to help out an abject criminal, former President Donald Trump. Interestingly, Doug, none of the Republicans really had many questions for me. I ended up spending all of my time as a witness before Congress answering largely friendly and factual questions from the Democrats on the committee.
Yeah, and that's why you are my first choice to be Kamala Harris's Attorney General. They know who they're dealing with when they look at Glenn Kirschner. So I will happily defer to your opinion on Judge Basham, but the one thing I wish he hadn't said, he said that sentencing Trump before the election would be election interference. I would submit the exact opposite is true. I would say that not sentencing him, and I understand why you said he didn't, I would submit that is election interference.
Yeah, that was not Judge Merchan's finest moment. And I think he may have actually couched it in terms like, listen, people might misperceive this as election interference. But I agree with you. I don't think that was a helpful comment or observation. I think the far better practice is the one that Judge Tanya Chutkan in Washington, D.C. and Donald Trump's federal prosecution has adopted. She said, my case, my deadlines, my due dates, my court filings will not yield or be dependent on any election cycle. And she has walked the walk every minute she has presided over Donald Trump's federal prosecution in D.C. for trying to steal the 2020 presidential election.
Yeah, I've come to start calling her no-nonsense Chutkan. And I got to say, Glenn, from what I could discern, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg did Judge or Justice Merchan no favors by not really taking a position on this issue and essentially saying what he said, which ostensibly dropped the whole decision into Merchan's lap. And he even alluded to that in his decision, right?
Yeah, so we use this magic term, and Alvin Bragg used it in that instance. Sometimes we prosecutors say, Your Honor, we defer to the court when we want to put the issue squarely in the court's hands without taking a formal position. Rarely did I do that as a prosecutor, Doug. When I did do it, it would be on issues of no real consequence to the prosecution. My client, the people, that's the only client I ever had in 30 plus years. The people, not unlike Vice President Harris. That's the only client she has ever served. If it didn't hurt the position of my client, the people, I would defer to the court. Like if a defense attorney said, you know what, Judge, I can't be present in court on Friday because I have a conflict. So can we please hold the sentencing on Monday or Wednesday of the following week? I might say, I defer to the court, Your Honor, because I don't have a dog in that fight. Because, you know, in the ordinary run-of-the-mill case, it really doesn't matter if sentencing proceeds on a Monday or a Wednesday or a Friday.
Yeah. One other thing Merchan said that kind of raised my eyebrows, quote, despite the litany of unsubstantiated grievances, Trump and his attorneys included in their request to delay sentencing, end quote. I mean, really? It's like you're admitting they lied to you in their motion to postpone, and you're rewarding by postponing. I mean, I understand why. We'll move on. What I heard, Glenn, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the good news is some experts have suggested that Merchan's decision just might signal his intention to sentence Trump to actual prison time. Do you put any stock in that?
Here's my take on that. I think it's a supportable position. I do think it may make it a little bit easier for Judge Merchan to impose a period of incarceration, confinement, imprisonment. You know, I think it would be challenging for any judge to impose a prison term on a candidate for president of the United States or a president-elect, for goodness sake, in the horrific event Donald Trump was elected on November 5th, which he will not be. He's going to lose in a landslide, in my non-scientific, non-political pundit opinion. But I do think it makes it easier and perhaps even more likely that Judge Merchan will sentence Donald Trump to prison after he loses the election. And here's why I don't know if I'm an outlier. I've heard a lot of prognosticators saying, oh, he's not going to sentence him to prison. I disagree. And here's why I disagree. I think Judge Merchan understands to his core that if you take a defendant who committed 34 felony crimes to try to steal a presidential election, and on top of that, who was convicted of 10 counts of contempt of court during the pendency of the case, because he absolutely will not follow any orders of a court. If you don't sentence somebody like that to prison, you know what you're doing? You're announcing to the whole world, and most directly to the next batch of aspiring dictators, that they can do it all over again, and they will not run the risk of even one day in a jail cell. That is the most supremely dangerous signal to send. We sentence people to prison. There are 5 principles of sentencing, but I'm only going to talk about 2. Specific deterrent. That means deterring this guy, this corrupt criminal, Donald Trump, from ever engaging in these kind of crimes again. But even more importantly, in the context of this case, general deterrence. What does that mean? Sending a signal to everybody else who might try to, cheat in and steal a presidential election, that if you do it, you're going to land in prison. Because if Judge Merchan sentences Donald Trump to some kind of home detention down at Mar-a-Lago, that is like sentencing him to binge watch Netflix and order DoorDash. That's the opposite of punishment. Donald Trump would probably love to not have to be out there on the campaign trail, instead just binge watching Netflix and ordering DoorDash. That's the opposite of punishment for your crimes. So I believe to my core that Judge Merchan understands that and will sentence him to a period of confinement.
If you are just joining us, we are grateful to be visiting with former prosecutor and NBC legal analyst Glenn Kirschner. Glenn, what would happen to this sentencing date of November 26th if, God forbid, if Trump were to win in November? I mean, it's a state case, so we can't get rid of it, although I suspect he'll try. What would happen?
It's an open question. I can give you my best guess, and it is that Donald Trump would beat feet filing motions to put a temporary stay on any period of incarceration to which he was sentenced. He would try to first go through the New York State appellate court system. He would then try to jump into the federal court system, which sometimes litigants can do and sometimes they can't. But here is where all bets are off, Doug. The Supreme Court of the United States is no longer an honest broker of the law or the Constitution when it comes to Donald Trump. So I can't say that they wouldn't nefariously grab hold of that case or that petition for review for a stay to put a stop to his sentence of incarceration and say, oh, we can't possibly let that happen to a president-elect. There will be no constitutional authority or support or precedent for that position, but we have all seen the Supreme Court go rogue and not only ignore the text of the Constitution, and aren't they always billing themselves as textualists? We have seen them contradict, indeed cannibalize, the very text of the Constitution in their determination to do favors for Donald Trump, to revoke women's constitutional privacy rights, and on so many other fronts. This is where we are. And once we have a Harris administration, once we have a prosecutor in the Oval Office, I have some hope that we will then turn our attention to the rot at the top, the Supreme Court, because that issue has to be taken on.
Agree, Glenn. Two-parter, and then we'll move on to Florida. Part one, I've read that if Trump wants to appeal this case all the way to the Supreme Court, it's likely to fail, as there would have to be a constitutional issue or argument. Several legal experts say there isn't one. Want to know if you agree. Part two, everything that transpired in this case occurred before Trump became president, with the exception of the reimbursement to Michael Cohen. So right. I don't see how presidential immunity even fits into this case.
It doesn't if the Supreme Court is honest to its own dishonest presidential immunity ruling. But I don't believe they necessarily will be. I hate to even bring this up, Doug, but the most frightening statement in that entire presidential immunity case from the Supreme Court is we're giving Donald Trump presumptive immunity for official presidential acts, even if they dwell on the outer perimeter of a president's authority. We're giving them presumptive immunity at a minimum, unless he might need more. They left open the question of whether they're going to now disregard their own prior ruling on the immunity issue and give Donald Trump even more immunity. So first of all, I agree with the legal scholars who are on record as saying there is no constitutional issue really for the Supreme Court to grab hold of in Donald Trump's state court case. But of course, it doesn't mean they won't anyway. So, I don't think I would put my full $1 bet. That's my betting limit. I'm not a gambling man. I'm not a high roller. I wouldn't put I wouldn't put the full buck on the Supreme Court staying out of the New York State court case.
I remember that from our first interview, your $1 limit. Although I do recall there was one question I asked you. You said you'd actually put $2 on. So
yeah, I must have felt really confident because that makes me nervous. That's a big bet for me.
Okay, let's move to the Trump document case in Florida, which I have said all along, and I'm not the only one, is the slam dunk case of the four. I mean, Glenn, we were told the New York election interference case was the weakest, and it garnered 34 felony convictions. Trump faces 4 federal felony charges in Florida. Do you agree that this is the slam dunk of them all?
Oh, yeah. The only impediment to a conviction is 1, Aileen Cannon, and 2, the U.S. Supreme Court. On the facts, that case is overwhelming. There is no such thing as a sure winner. I know that in my 30 years of trying cases.
This might be a $2-bucker, Glenn.
This is about as close as you get to a sure thing. Donald Trump is charged with primarily 3 categories of crimes. Unlawfully retaining classified documents. There's no factual argument that he didn't commit that crime. Obstructing justice by refusing to return them when a subpoena, a grand jury subpoena, which has the force of a court order, was issued for their return. He hid them and then told his lawyers to lie about the fact that he hid them. No, there's no factual defense to that charge, and a violation of our nation's espionage laws. I think that's the most challenging of the 3 batches. Also a lay-down winner for prosecutors, in my opinion. But of course, you have a dirty judge, nefarious judge in Judge Aileen Cannon, who has been reversed twice for abusing her discretion by an all-Republican appointed panel of judges down at the 11th Circuit. And now she picked up on Clarence Thomas's little love note in the form of a separate concurrence saying, hey, psst, come on, Aileen, just go ahead and dismiss it, claiming that special counsel's just not a thing. Special counsel is a thing and has been a thing since the 1800s in our, criminal justice system. But, she nefariously dismissed the case. It's at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. They will reverse her, I believe, unanimously. The only open question to me is whether they will sua sponte, meaning on their own without anybody asking them to, reassign the case to another judge, a fair, independent, impartial judge. I've seen federal circuit courts of appeal do that before. This is where they should do that. But if they don't, I think maybe 3 strikes and you're out, being reversed 3 times for doing unlawful favors for Donald Trump. That may finally prompt Jack Smith to file a motion to recuse. Ultimately, that case will go back on the trial track. And provided Donald Trump doesn't win the election on November 5th, he will be convicted in, just a bloodbath on the evidence.
So Jack Smith appealed Cannon's ruling back in August. I mean, it's now the middle of October. What's going to happen next and when?
I don't know if there has been I don't think all the briefs have, I can't remember if all the briefs have been submitted. And I don't know that the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals has set an argument date yet. But listen, we're on a slow train to nowhere. The federal courts of appeal move typically at a glacial pace. That's something else that I have suggested needs to change. We need like an interbranch dispute court where federal courts put things on expedited tracks, which they can do with an internal rules change. They don't need an act of Congress to do it. That's some discussion for another day. So many problems that we need to fix. And I think the Harris administration will take on these challenges. But we're not going to get a decision probably until early next year on whether Judge Cannon's dismissal of Trump's case will be reversed.
Do you think Jack Smith should have filed already to have her dismissed?
I do. I think it's a mistake. And listen, I give huge props to Jack Smith. He has gone as aggressively as he can, professionally, appropriately, but aggressively. He has information behind the scenes that I don't have available to me. So whatever he is using to make that decision, he has decided the time is not yet right to file a motion to recuse. And yet when you look at the federal law, the standard to have a judge removed is if a judge's impartiality might reasonably be questioned, the judge shall disqualify themselves. That's a fairly low bar. Boy, she has leapt over that bar, months and months and months ago. And I don't know why Jack Smith has declined to file the motion. We'll see if that changes.
While we're grading performance, one thing I've always believed was probably Merrick Garland's biggest mistake. I think the day after he was sworn in, he should have appointed a special counsel to investigate one of, if not the most horrific days in this nation's history. Instead, we lost a year, and look at where we are now. Do you agree?
Whether he appointed special counsel or not, there may not have been a conflict. Well, first of all, he wasn't confirmed until I think March. So there was some time that passed between the insurrection and when Merrick Garland came on board as Attorney General. And the special counsel thing is really most appropriate when you have a direct conflict between the Attorney General and by extension the president, and then somebody on the other side, like a candidate who's running against the president. So, but more fundamentally, if I were Attorney General, which trust me will never happen, I think I am too much of a threat to the ruling class criminals writ large, because I would take them all down, or do my best to take them all down, hold them accountable, and I would completely retool the priorities of the criminal justice system because, boy, we go hard and fast and aggressively over somebody who snatches a purse or sells a rock of crack. We might even put you in pretrial detention. But you know what? You steal billions of dollars, you victimize enormous swaths of the American population, we're going to let you go. Maybe we'll make you pay a fine and some back taxes. But, that right now, our criminal justice system priorities are turned on their heads. We're living in the legal upside down. So that needs to change, in my opinion. But I would have applied for an arrest warrant on January 20th, the minute Donald Trump left office. At a minimum, I would have taken volume 2 of the Mueller report, which documents multiple felony obstruction of justice charges, slapped what we call a face sheet on it, walked into the judge in chambers in federal court in my old stomping grounds and say, Judge, probable cause, which there is in spades in volume 2 of the Mueller report. But Doug, because we decline to hold these ruling class criminals accountable for their crimes, is why we get more crimes being committed by the ruling class criminals. This ain't rocket science. This is basic law enforcement, and we have fallen down on the job. Again, I hope once we get a prosecutor in the Oval Office, the priorities begin to change.
So, Chutkan granted Smith's request to file an oversized 180-page brief exceeding the standard 45-page limit. On August 27th, Smith filed essentially, I guess, a truncated superseding indictment, mindful of the ridiculous Supreme Court immunity decision. The charges are basically the same. Do you think this truncated case, if not as strong as the original one, is still strong, or do you think it's just as strong?
Oh, it's just as strong. There's very little that they had to redact out. For example, one of the things they did is they pulled out the name of one of the co-conspirators, Jeffrey Clark, who was really one of the most horrifically corrupt DOJ officials, certainly in my lifetime and maybe in our nation's history. He joined Donald Trump's conspiracy to corrupt and weaponize the Department of Justice to try to help Donald Trump steal the 2020 election, pulled Jeffrey Clark's name out. That's only temporary because the Supreme Court said that a president can commission his DOJ officials to commit crimes, and there's nothing that can be done about it. That is insanity. That is law enforcement and constitutional law insanity. But in my estimation, when you read the second or superseding indictment, it's just as strong as the first. And it makes clear that Donald Trump did these things not as official presidential acts, but as a candidate who was trying to steal the presidency. And for that, you don't get immunity even by the Supreme Court's view of the Constitution.
Yeah. So after the filing, Chutkan released the filing with minor redactions. What stood out to you the most, Glenn? What did we learn that we didn't already know?
You know, I think the two most important words that will have a D.C. jury convicting Donald Trump in a D.C. minute, just like the New York jury convicted him in a New York minute, the two words are, so what?
Yeah.
Donald Trump is sitting in the small dining room off the Oval Office watching the darn insurrection on TV, watching our police officers get the hell beat out of them. And people are streaming into the dining room saying, Mr. President, stop the madness. Send a signal, send a message, tell your supporters to stop. They are now hunting for the vice president. They're going to hurt him. And Donald Trump said, so what? A president has the constitutional duty, obligation to take care that the laws of the nation be faithfully executed. Donald Trump so grossly violated his constitutional duty and showed himself to be perhaps certainly the most callous president who has ever, occupied the Oval Office. So what? I don't care if the vice president is in harm's way, might be hanged. I want power. Those two words will convict him in a D.C. minute once we get this case to trial.
And Glenn, as shocking as those two words were and are, it's no surprise to those of us who live in the real world. As a sociopathic, malignant narcissist, that is the only reaction of which Trump is capable. But here's something that confused me. I read that Jack Smith opposed the release of any portions of his superseding indictment. Why would he take that position?
He opposed the release of portions of the So you mean the redactions that he made?
No, he opposed the release of any part of the superseding indictment.
Well, the superseding indictment is public. It's been made public. And then he put that 165-page narrative together, the first 85 pages of which are the story of Donald Trump's crimes. And the balance of that filing is the law, the argument that his crimes should not enjoy presidential immunity. And now what they're fighting over is the release of the appendix, which is all the evidence that supports the 85-page narrative of Donald Trump's crimes. And there was a brand new filing today in the case from Donald Trump's lawyers trying to put a stop, because today is the deadline, to release the appendix. The appendix is like the grand jury transcripts and the FBI write-ups. It's all the evidence that supports the narrative in the filing. So I don't know that, I'm not sure when he opposed the release of the superseding indictment, but indictments are, unless they are filed under seal, they are ordinarily public documents, indictments.
Okay.
So that's where I think the status of that litigation is right now.
If you are just joining us, we are visiting with former prosecutor and NBC legal analyst Glenn Kirschner. Well, Glenn, let's move on to Sweet Georgia. I think that's the most complicated and sprawling case of the four, and that's been gummed up due to the immunity decision. Trump is trying to have the entire case dismissed on immunity grounds, as innocent people do. And as I understand it, Judge McAfee tossed out 6 charges in May and then 3 more in September. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, but let's not forget, first of all, the charges that he threw out ultimately do not affect the maximum possible prison term for Donald Trump, which far exceeds Donald Trump's life expectancy. And interestingly, when you read Judge McAfee's ruling, some of the charges, he said, I'm not saying Donald Trump didn't commit these crimes. I'm just saying they're more appropriately brought as federal crimes as opposed to state crimes. Hello, Jack Smith. I know you're busy. I know you have your hands full, but leave no Trump crime behind. Let's get on top of all of them. For example, Doug, not to depart from Georgia, we'll go back there, but if we can shoot up to my old home state, New Jersey, for a minute, we have Donald Trump committing espionage crimes on audio tape at his Bedminster Golf Club when he's showing, contingency military attack plans on Iran, for gosh sakes. And he is saying, I could have declassified these while I was president, but I can't now. Espionage, thank you. I don't quite understand why some of the crimes Donald Trump seems to have committed, based even only on the public reporting, have gone unindicted. But I still believe Jack Smith has an overarching plan. Let me say this, Doug. Watergate, the crimes that were committed as part of the Watergate scandal, produced 69 indictments and 48 criminal convictions. And Watergate was like a damn parking ticket as compared to the crimes of Donald Trump and his many co-conspirators. And it took years for the Watergate cases to work their way through the system. Jack Smith's just getting warmed up. And provided Donald Trump doesn't win the presidency, he will spend the rest of his life in courtrooms and jail cells, in case after case after case. Going back down to Georgia, at the moment, it's on a slow track to nowhere, because I think there's going to be an appellate argument in February, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe April, regarding Judge McAfee's ruling that District Attorney Fani Willis is not disqualified, does not have to be removed from the case. But listen, there are RICO cases in Georgia that have been in the courts for years. It can take a very long time under the Georgia system.
Now, what about the other 18 people who were charged in Georgia? Some of them cop pleas, but they shouldn't be affected by the immunity ruling, should they?
Not the ones who cop pleas. No, they are cooperating witnesses, and they will remain in that status unless they file a motion to withdraw their plea, which is a motion that can be filed but is rarely granted for lots of reasons I won't go into. But yeah, they just have to wait until their time comes to testify, as they promised they would do when they struck the cooperation agreement with the prosecutors. But the rest of those defendants are probably going to be, waiting for the appellate process to work its way out until the case goes back to the trial court and gets back on a trial track.
In all the years you spent as a prosecutor, Glenn, were there times when you just became so frustrated at how slow the wheels of justice turn?
I would say only every day. No, you know what? Listen, in the normal practice of criminal law, things do not move so slowly, in part because you don't have nefarious litigants like Donald Trump trying to gum up the works at every turn. The only thing I think he's any good at, besides grifting his base, he's forever stealing from his base and fooling the gullible. Besides that, he is good at delay. He is good at, delaying the system and avoiding responsibility for his crimes. He's proved that over and over again.
I want to ask the same question I asked about Trump's election interference case in New York. If he were to win, and again, God forbid, what happens to the Georgia case? Again, it's a state case, but we're talking Donald Trump.
Every case goes away with a corrupt dismissal or having the military intervene to not allow Donald Trump to be pulled into court to defend himself. Listen, Donald Trump said, I will use the military against my radical left-wing opponents and the threat from within, the American people. He's on record as saying that multiple times. You really think he's going to say, well, I don't have a legitimate legal vehicle to keep from being tried, convicted, and sentenced in state court, so I'm just going to subject myself to that as president of the United States? Are you kidding me? He will violate every law known to man and woman to make sure he is not brought to justice in any state court. Now, that's the illegal approach, and he will avail himself of that. the legal argument would be the supremacy clause kicks in that says anytime there's a conflict between a federal law and a state law, the state law yields. And because the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice issued an ill-advised opinion that you can't prosecute a sitting president of the United States, mind you, that's not law. So I'm not making a winning argument now. I'm just making a legal argument that I believe Trump's lawyers will make. The supremacy clause should stand for the proposition that if he is ever to be tried in a state court, if those cases are to move forward, it has to await him leaving the presidential office again. So, all of these questions are untested, but I think that's, he's not going to care because he'll deploy the military to make sure he's not brought to account in state courts.
Yeah. So now, does Georgia Judge Scott McAfee, does he have the same responsibility Judges Chutkan and Merchan have with regards to the immunity decision?
That's an open question that I haven't yet heard raised. So unless I've missed something in the reporting, which is entirely possible, I don't think that has been raised by any of the litigants in that litigation down in Georgia. But because the crimes Donald Trump committed, like calling Brad Raffensperger and talking like a mob boss, just find me 11,780 votes that fell off the back of a truck and declare me the winner of the election in Georgia. I mean, that is just such direct evidence of crime. It's laughable, but that was done while he was president. He was still trying to steal the presidency. I would maintain it does not enjoy presidential immunity, but you can bet when the time is right, those motions will be filed by Trump and company, and they'll have to be litigated.
Mm-hmm. Final question, Glenn, before we let you go. Earlier you said you suspect Kamala Harris will win in a landslide. Is that a Kirschner $1 bet or $2?
All right, I have to be honest with myself and with the viewers and the listeners. I would probably put 95 cents of my $1 on Kamala Harris not only winning, but let me be even more foolish in my predictions. Joe Biden, who I don't think is an exceptionally good candidate, I think he was an exceptionally good president. I think he governs really well. I don't think he campaigns particularly well. And if Kamala Harris becomes our next president, Joe Biden will have saved the republic twice. Once when he defeated Donald Trump, and the second time when he decided to step aside and turn it over to a new generation, Kamala Harris. That is, he needs to go down in history as one of the most courageous and generous American presidents ever. But he won by 7 million votes. I think Kamala Harris will win by 10 million or more, in large part because we are always looking to women to help save our nation in so many ways. And I think women, and hopefully men, but certainly women, will remain motivated by the fact that the Republicans revoked their constitutional privacy and autonomy rights to make their own reproductive health decisions. They are going to go to the polls in record numbers. I hope they either drag us men with them, or the men man up and go and, understand how important that issue is for our wives and daughters and granddaughters and aunts and friends and neighbors and partners. But yeah, I think she's going to win by 10 million. I know it comes down to the battleground states, but throw all the polls out. I believe this is going to be a very lopsided election.
Glenn Kirschner, you are the best. We're grateful you could spend some time with us today. Thanks for helping us make sense of these most frustrating cases. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep doing what you do, because as a wise man, a former wrestler and football player and patriot once said, justice matters. Hell yeah.
Thanks, Doug. Great being with you again.
Take care, Glenn.
All right.
That's it, folks. That's a wrap. We will do this all over again tomorrow, hopefully with you. Until then, take care.
Did you know the cost to American